The Great Chinese Famine, spanning from 1959 to 1961, remains one of the most harrowing human tragedies of the modern era. What began as an ambitious effort to reshape China's agricultural and industrial landscape quickly spiraled into an unfathomable nightmare. Entire communities succumbed to starvation as food supplies dwindled, leaving millions to perish in the grips of an artificial catastrophe. Villages were eerily silent, broken only by the wails of the dying and the desperate whispers of those left behind. The horror of famine did not discriminate. Children, the elderly, and the strong alike wasted away, their bodies emaciated beyond recognition. As the days stretched into years, the countryside became a land of despair, where even the most basic human dignity was stripped away in the relentless pursuit of survival. At the heart of this disaster was Mao Zedong's radical vision for transforming China into an industrial superpower. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, sought to accelerate economic growth through collectivized farming and mass labor mobilization. In rural areas, private land ownership was abolished, and farmers were forced into communes where production was centrally controlled. These policies were based on flawed agronomic theories and political zeal rather than practical farming experience. As a result, crops failed on a massive scale, yet local officials, fearing repercussions, reported exaggerated yields to the government. In response, the state seized grain at levels far beyond what the land had actually produced, leaving rural populations to starve. Meanwhile, in cities, rationing was implemented, but urban residents still fared far better than their rural counterparts, as food was diverted to sustain industrial productivity at the expense of those toiling in the fields. The ecological devastation caused by the Four Pests campaign further deepened the crisis. Mao's war on sparrows, part of a misguided effort to increase grain yields, had catastrophic consequences. Sparrows were seen as pests that consumed valuable crops, and their mass extermination was encouraged nationwide. However, their disappearance disrupted the delicate balance of nature, leading to an explosion in the population of crop-eating insects, particularly locusts. With their natural predator eliminated, these insects devoured vast fields of grain, compounding the already disastrous food shortages. The government's failure to foresee these consequences only hastened the famine spread, turning once fertile lands into barren wastelands incapable of sustaining life. Desperation gripped the nation as food supplies vanished. The starving turned to the unimaginable, consuming tree bark, grass, and even soil in futile attempts to quell their gnawing hunger. Families, unable to feed their children, abandoned them in cities in the hope that urban officials might provide sustenance. Others resorted to scavenging for anything remotely edible, from leather scraps to the corpses of the deceased. In some regions, reports surfaced of people committing the unthinkable. Cannibalism became a grim reality for those left with no other means to survive. The government, instead of acknowledging its role in the catastrophe, suppressed information and punished those who dared to speak the truth. The famine was not merely a natural disaster. It was a man-made horror that stood as a chilling testament to the dangers of ideological extremism, blind ambition, and unchecked political power. As the famine deepened, the Chinese countryside became an open-air graveyard where the distinction between the living and the dead blurred with each passing day. Skeletal figures stumbled through barren fields, their bodies so emaciated that even the simplest movements became unbearable. Farmers, once the backbone of China's food production, collapsed beside their withered crops, their final breaths taken in the very soil they had tilled for generations. Entire villages faded into ghostly silence, their residents succumbing to starvation in numbers too great to count. Families huddled together, watching helplessly as their loved ones wasted away, their sunken eyes reflecting a shared agony. The air reeked of decay as corpses were left unburied, either because there was no strength left to dig graves or because death had become so common that burial lost its meaning. Hunger was not the only killer. Disease spread like wildfire among the weakened population. Malnourished bodies, stripped of their ability to fight infection, became breeding grounds for deadly illnesses. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and typhoid fever ravaged entire communities, their symptoms exacerbated by extreme hunger. Children bore the brunt of this dual assault, their frail forms unable to withstand the relentless wave of sickness. In the decades that followed, Scientific studies reveal the long-term effects of this famine, exposing a grim reality. Those who survived carried its scars in their very DNA. Epigenetic changes, alterations in gene expression caused by extreme malnutrition, left future generations predisposed to chronic illnesses, stunted growth, and weakened immune systems. The famine did not merely claim those who lived through it. It reached forward in time, shaping the health and fate of those yet unborn. In the face of such despair, the human instinct for survival took on terrifying forms. Families, once bound by love, were driven to unfathomable extremes, their morality eroded by the overwhelming force of starvation. Parents, consumed by desperation, made the unthinkable choice to sacrifice one child to feed another. In villages where the dead outnumbered the living, graves were dug open in the dead of night, the remains scavenged for sustenance. Black markets emerged, trading in human flesh. Whispers of desperate transactions echoed in the shadows, where dignity and horror intertwined. These acts were not the result of cruelty or evil but of an inescapable biological urge, a final, horrific attempt to delay death for just one more day. Despite the widespread suffering, the government refused to acknowledge the full extent of the catastrophe. Propaganda masked the brutal reality, and those who spoke the truth were silenced through imprisonment or execution. The suffering of millions was dismissed as the price of progress and necessary sacrifice for the ideological vision of the state. In official records, the famine was minimized, rebranded as a period of natural hardship rather than a policy-induced disaster. But the voices of the dead could not be erased, nor could the trauma of those who endured the horror. The Great Chinese Famine was not just a historical event, it was a scar upon the soul of a nation, a wound so deep that even generations later, its echoes still lingered in the genetic and collective memory of its people. Children, the most defenseless victims of the Great Chinese Famine, bore the brunt of the suffering with no means to protect or fend for themselves. As food supplies dwindled and families struggled to survive, many parents faced a harrowing choice: watch their children starve or abandon them in the desperate hope that someone else might offer them a chance at life. Infants were left outside orphanages, temples, or along dusty roadsides, their cries fading into the unforgiving silence of a dying world. In Shanghai, thousands of children were rounded up and sent to Inner Mongolia under the guise of government intervention, with officials promising a haven of food and shelter. Instead, these children found themselves stranded in an unfamiliar land, trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare that erased their names, histories, and identities. Alone in a hostile environment, many perished, their existence wiped from official records as if they had never lived at all. For the fortunate few, strangers stepped in to fill the void left by lost families, offering shelter and protection. Some were taken in by compassionate farmers or workers who treated them as their own, though even these households struggled to provide for another mouth. Others, however, were met with cruelty, subjected to neglect, mistreatment, or forced into hard labor in exchange for a meager scrap of food. Many children were reduced to a state of servitude, their youth stolen by the unrelenting demands of survival. The trauma of separation left permanent scars, shaping their futures with the shadow of a past they could barely remember. Decades later, these abandoned children, nicknamed the Shanghai Dolls, would embark on painful journeys to uncover their origins, sifting through fragmented memories and faded documents in a desperate attempt to reclaim their lost identities. But for many, the truth was forever buried beneath the weight of history, irretrievable and erased. As the famine intensified, government policies only deepened the suffering, ripping families apart in the name of industrial progress. The Great Leap Forward's demand for rapid steel production uprooted rural farmers from their villages, forcing them into makeshift factories where they toiled under grueling conditions. With fathers and older sons sent away for labor, mothers and young children were left behind to fend for themselves in an unforgiving landscape of scarcity. Entire communities crumbled under the strain, as the elderly, frail to contribute, were left to die alone. In communal farms, once envisioned as the backbone of collectivized prosperity, starvation turned into an unrelenting death sentence. The absence of traditional family structures severed the last ties of support, leaving countless souls to wither away in isolation. The psychological toll of this suffering echoed through generations. Survivors of the famine carried its ghosts within them, their bodies forever marked by malnutrition, their minds haunted by the memories of loss. The orphan children of this era grew into adults with a fractured sense of self, struggling to reconcile their pasts with the present. Some found solace in reconstructing their histories, while others were left wandering, burdened by unanswered questions. The state's relentless pursuit of ideological progress had not only stolen their childhoods, but also fractured the very fabric of Chinese society, leaving behind an entire generation defined by hunger, loss, and the cruel indifference of a nation that had failed to protect its most vulnerable. In an attempt to meet increasingly impossible government-imposed grain quotas, local officials resorted to falsifying production figures. The exaggerated numbers meant that the state collected far more grain than was actually produced, leaving the farmers who had worked tirelessly in the fields with nothing. As the rations promised to the population ran out, starvation spread rapidly across the countryside. With the situation worsening by the day, anyone even suspected of hoarding food was accused of treason and brutally punished. The government's unrelenting demands and the lack of resources led to widespread suffering, and the desperate measures taken only served to escalate the crisis. The disintegration of social order became undeniable as the famine ravaged the land. People no longer had the strength or will to bury their dead, and so corpses were left to rot wherever they fell, inside homes, along roadsides, and scattered across fields. The once familiar faces of neighbors and friends had become nothing more than skeletal figures, a haunting reminder of the regime's incompetence. Yet, in this time of overwhelming loss, few dared to speak out against the government, knowing that doing so would mean certain death. Fear of severe retribution silenced most dissenters, while survival became the sole concern. The bonds that once united communities were shattered, and in their place, hunger ruled every decision. As the famine deepened, even the most sacred places were not spared in the government's pursuit of agricultural efficiency. Burial grounds, once considered sacred resting places for the dead, were plowed over and turned into farmland. Grieving families were forced to watch helplessly as the graves of their loved ones were erased from existence in the name of production. Official records claimed that thousands of graves were exhumed, yet no effort was made to preserve the remains, nor was there any respect for the deceased. The government's relentless drive for higher output saw nothing as sacred, not even the sanctity of death. In this dystopian environment, society had become unrecognizable. What was once a thriving community, built on mutual support and trust, had now descended into chaos. Neighbors turned on one another, and the basic moral compass that once guided relationships had been distorted by the overwhelming need to survive. Where there had once been empathy, there was now suspicion. Where there had been kindness, there was greed. The very fabric of society had unraveled, leaving behind a hollow existence where the only law was that of hunger, and the only reality was that of endless suffering. Decades after the famine, China's leadership finally acknowledged the devastating consequences of Mao Zedong's policies. In 2013, President Xi Jinping made a rare public admission that the Great Leap Forward had been fraught with mistakes, marking one of the few official recognitions of the famine's horrors. This admission, however, came too late to undo the damage done. While it served as a significant moment of reckoning, it did little to shed light on the full extent of the disaster. Historical records, still tightly controlled by the government, make it nearly impossible for researchers to access the raw data necessary to understand the true scale of the tragedy. Estimates of the death toll from the famine range dramatically, from 15 to 45 million, but the true scope of the disaster may never be known. The Chinese government's reluctance to release detailed and comprehensive records has left historians to rely on fragmented accounts pieced together from survivor testimonies and population studies. These efforts, though significant, only offer glimpses into the unimaginable suffering endured during those years. The secrecy surrounding the famine serves as a chilling reminder of the extent to which governments will go to suppress uncomfortable truths, burying the evidence of their failures in order to protect their power and legitimacy. Despite the passage of time and the efforts to move forward, the scars of the Great Chinese Famine continue to haunt the nation. Generations of descendants still bear the burden of their ancestors' suffering, whether it manifests in inherited trauma or in the heavy weight of knowing that the history of this period remains deliberately obscured by political agendas. For many, the famine is not just a distant historical event but a painful, ongoing reality that shapes their understanding of both the past and the present. The lack of transparency surrounding the event means that the full emotional and historical impact remains inaccessible to most, leaving a wound that has never fully healed. The famine stands as a powerful testament to the dangers of unchecked power and ideological extremism. It is a dark chapter in history, one that cannot be erased or ignored, even if the government continues to suppress it. The consequences of the Great Leap Forward are not confined to the past. They resonate in the lives of those who continue to live with the aftermath, and in the collective memory of a society that has yet to fully confront its painful history. This chapter demands remembrance not just for those who perished in the famine, but for those who continue to bear its psychological and cultural consequences, and for future generations who must learn from this tragedy to avoid repeating it. Thanks for tuning into the past. Don't forget to subscribe and join me for more stories that shaped our world.